We have Daryl Beyers here today. He's going to talk to us about soil, which we all, I'm sure, could always use some help improving our soil and making sure that everything grows beautifully. He is the author of the New Gardener's Handbook, Everything You Need to Grow a Beautiful and Bountiful Garden. As a gardening certificate program coordinator at the New York Botanical Garden, he helps guide the program's curriculum, teaches the popular Fundamentals of Gardening course, and other courses about garden design. He has more than 30 years of professional landscape experience specializing in residential garden design and development. He was a staff writer, photographer, and editor for Fine Gardening, or might still be. Are you?
Not anymore. Nope.
Not anymore. He authored 2 special issues on garden design and served as a contributing editor for Martha Stewart Living. He also has articles in Horticulture and HGTV magazine. He's also on Instagram. I was told that this is not a big Instagram group, but I'm on Instagram. I don't put anything on Instagram, but it's a great place to search for things. And they have so much on gardening. It's really fun. So I encourage anybody to get on. He's at the New Gardener's Handbook on Instagram. So I will turn it over to Daryl, and he'll talk for a while, and then we'll have hopefully time for questions and answers.
Sure. So welcome, everybody. My name, again, is Daryl Beyers. I'm here to talk about soil for the Garden Club. What we're going to do is we're going to go through, I have a little presentation that I want to go through, and then we will hold questions till the end just for the continuity with the video and things like that. So we're going to do it that way. Lots of times I teach a lot of classes, so lots of times I open things up and it becomes free form, and we get lots of questions, and we don't get to the end of the show. So we're going to try to focus on getting to the end of the show, but what part of it is going to be talking about the soil here. Like Jane said, I'm the author of the New Gardener's Handbook. We can talk about that. It says New Gardener's Handbook, but it's really, I've had a lot of really good feedback from experienced gardeners who have learned a thing or two from some of the chapters that are in that book. We use it as the textbook for the Fundamentals of Gardening course at NYBG. If anyone's interested in it later, we can. I have copies, and I can provide you with a copy at the end of the program, just in case you're interested, or if you know somebody that might want one. But let's talk about soil. Here we are in spring. It might feel like summer today, but it's spring technically still, and this is a great time to be thinking about your soil. And not everybody. One of the things that I learned as an early gardener was that I didn't put enough attention into creating a good, healthy, living soil so my plants would succeed. A lot of the reasons why early planted, plants that you put in the ground don't quite make it or don't thrive like you want them to is because it's the ground underneath, it's the soil, the roots. One thing that I always stress in all of my gardening talks and my classes is the idea that the roots and the shoots balance each other out. And so to have good shoots, in other words, nice stems, leaves, the flowers, the fruits, all the things that we grow most of our plants for, unless it's a carrot or something like that. To have those healthy shoots, we actually need healthy roots to support them. They actually support each other. It's about balancing the roots and the shoots. And the environment where your roots live is not the same as the environment where your shoots live. They're underground. And we tend to just see our roots once, and then we hope that everything is going okay under there. So lots of times I even tell my gardening students or anybody that asks, if they're having a problem with a plant, think about what might be going on underground before you worry yourself about what's going on above ground, unless you see a pest or a disease or something really obvious. Oftentimes, weak plants on the top are a result of weak roots down below. So since that's the world where your roots live, we want to make sure that we provide it with a happy, healthy place for them to grow their best, and then you're going to have better plants all the way around. That's the whole point of all this. And so the good news is we can promote a living soil, and it's relatively easy to accomplish, but I want to talk about some of the details of it so we understand why it's important. So we're promoting a living soil. That's the copy of the book. I have this quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "To forget how to dig in the earth and to tend the soil is to forget ourselves." So it is really important that you understand your soil. And I have to admit, when I first got into gardening, I didn't think about it enough. And now it seems like that's all I think about. I think about it all the time. All right. There's something called the soil food web out there. Some of you may have heard about this before. It's the living ingredient in your soil. Your soil is alive. That's the main thing to remember. It's not this inert stuff that you're just hunking the plants inside of. It's truly is alive. And part of the reason that makes it alive is there's this cycle called the soil food web that you may or may not have heard of before. It was developed by an agronomist named Elaine Ingram, but we don't have to get into all that, but I want to give her credit for coining the phrase. It starts with the stuff that falls off your plants in the first place, the detritus, the leaves, the stems, the things that just sort of fall off the plant and fall onto the ground. Those ingredients are broken down by microorganisms like bacteria and small little microorganisms. So the leaves and the stuff that falls on the ground is broken down by microorganisms and fungi, which are then eaten by, larger little critters and protozoas and amoebas and things like that. And then those are eaten by springtails and worms and things. And there's this whole sort of food web that takes place. What happens oftentimes is the food web gets interrupted where gardeners that are a little bit too tidy, a little bit too concerned about how neat and tidy their garden looks like, they rake up all the leaves. They rake up every little piece of detritus that falls on the ground, and they're neglecting to feed that soil food web. So I've come into gardens where for years they've been just raking and blowing everything out of the beds, and they've totally starved the soil food web in that way. The worst thing that you want to do is actually allow anybody anywhere with a backpack blower to go anywhere near your garden beds. I see it all the time. They go in there and they start blasting all that stuff away. And then what do? Then they sell you some mulch, right? So they're blowing all this stuff out that's actually really, really good for your soil to keep that cycle going. And then they come and they sell you some other stuff that isn't as nearly as good. Like a bark mulch isn't going to break down the same way that those leaves and stems and things like that are going to break down. And the good news is once you have a strong enough soil food web, a very active living soil food web, then you can just let that stuff fall on the ground and it actually decomposes really, really quickly. And that's how I can tell if a soil is still alive and doing what it's supposed to be doing, is how quickly some stuff that you just throw on the ground biodegrades. If it takes a month, you don't really have a very active soil food web. If it takes a week, you do, and it's happening. So you have to get to the point where you can do that. Lots of times, in my own garden, or even the client gardens that I work at where I've developed the soil food web over time, I can just take all my prunings, if it's not, woody stems and things like that, but just leaves and flowers and stuff, and I can just throw it right on the soil around the base of the plants. And within a week or so, they just kind of melt into the soil. That's what you're trying to get to with your ornamental beds. And then with your edible beds, you just have to sort of replenish it every time that you do a harvest. We tend to clean out the vegetables from the edible bed because that can be too much stuff. But you can take that stuff that you clean out, compost it, and then put it back after it's been composted, and you can replenish your garden, your vegetable garden beds in the same way. So you're trying to promote this soil food web. That's really the goal of the whole process. And if you know that it's been, like for example, if you've been blowing all the detritus out every year, and if you've been using any kind of synthetic fertilizers, which are a no-no, or if you've been using any herbicides or pesticides, you probably don't have a living soil food web, and you're going to want to start to get to the point where you can rebuild it. That's really part of your goal, and it could take multiple years for that to happen, unless you have a lot of money and a lot of help and you want to just sort of dig everything up and turn it all over and start all over again. But that can be like a little bit too much to do. Now, it is important, because we're working with a soil food web, you have to understand that your soil is alive. And this is one of my favorite quotes. Soil is a living and dynamic system that is fragile and perishable. Your soil is alive. It's a living system. It's also dynamic. It's changing all the time. Water is flowing through it. The bugs are crawling around inside of it. The fungi are growing and dying. Even your roots grow and die. Like pretty much like every season, about 10 to 15% of the roots of your plants die because they hit like a dead end where there's no nutrients or there's no water, but then they just grow somewhere else. So there's always a section of your roots that are dying as well. So things are changing in there. The nitrogen content changes all the time as well. There's a lot of things that are happening in your soil. So it's not like you make it and you fix it. and you're done. It's something that's ongoing forever. You really have to keep promoting it. And what you can do is you can get to the point where your garden can be self-sustaining, where the things that are falling down are refeeding it, but it takes time to get to that point. If any of you have been gardening the right way for the last 15, 20 plus years, you probably got really good soil. If you've been gardening and cheating and using like Miracle Grow and stuff like that, you probably don't have a living soil, and you have to start getting to the point where you do. And because, so your soil is alive, it's dynamic, it's fragile. You can break it. You can walk on it too much. You can drive a truck out over it too many times. If anyone's ever done like a remodeling or something outside of the house, you can really destroy the structure of the soil. You can wreck it. And because it's alive, it's perishable. You can kill it, right? Oops, spilled some gasoline. Oops, I over-fertilized with, phosphorus and I fried it out. So you can kill it. You can kill that soil food web. So you want to promote that living soil food web. That's the crux of this whole talk right here. And so let's talk a little bit about how that works and how we can promote it. First of all, it's good to understand what's in your soil. I know the print's a little bit small here, but I'll try to explain it. Basically, the construction of your soil is about 45% mineral particles. This is like the bedrock that gets broken up into small pieces. Like the stones that get ground down into, sand and clay and silt shaped sizes. Then you have about 20 to 30% of pockets for air and for water. This is a good soil. This is a healthy, balanced, well-structured soil. And then there's about a 5% section that is the organic matter. That's the living part of your soil. Some of it is the roots of the plants. Some of it is the actual critters that are living inside of the soil. And the rest of it is something called humus. Humus is the same as compost, which is the same as organic matter. I use them all interchangeably. We'll look at another slide and we'll talk about how humus happens and compost is created. That's kind of the trick. But you have this humus layer, and what's going on is the humus layer is what's feeding the living creatures inside of your soil, and that gets used up. So as a gardener, you can't do anything about the mineral content. That's just what it is. Depends on where you live, right? But you can control the organic matter content of your soil and allow it to either be replenished naturally on its own by just letting the leaves lie on the ground and things like that, or you can actively replenish it by adding organic matter to the soil each spring, or even sometimes multiple times a year, whenever you have some to put down, basically is the way that I do it. So that's your well-balanced soil. Sometimes what happens is if this 5% section gets depleted and the soil food web dies, what'll happen is the percentage of the mineral particles will get larger and you'll have less room for air and water pockets. That's called a compacted soil. That's what you're trying to avoid. So you can't do anything about what the minerals are made out of, but you can actively promote that living soil food web and the humus that goes into the soil to keep things balanced. That's what you have to get. This is the balance that you want to try to get to. There's something called soil texture. I'll touch on it quickly. You may have learned about soil texture in the past. It's basically the size of those mineral particles. So it's usually more of a matter of, do you have a sandy soil or do you have a clay soil? Silty soils tend to develop around ponds and rivers and things like that. But it's the size of those particles. And the size of those particles is determined by the kind of bedrock that you are gardening on. So we're all gardening on the earth somewhere, and there's different bedrocks throughout the earth. There's limestone in the Midwest, there's schist in Manhattan, there's granite in New Hampshire, and so whatever your bedrock is going to determine the texture of your soil. So you may have a sandier soil. If you're on Long Island, it's a sandy soil, or you may have a clay soil, which can be problematic each in their own right, but it is important to understand what the texture of your soil is. There's something called the soil texture triangle. This is my very simplistic version of it that I included in the book because I hate the soil texture triangle. I took a soil science course in college, almost failed because it was just so confusing, and I tried to find a way to teach it in a very simple way. And so the soil texture triangle is this really kind of complicated thing to try to figure out how much sand, silt, or clay-sized particles are in your soil, and I simplified it. So you could have a lot of sand, you could have a lot of clay, You could have a lot of silt-sized particles, but you just want to, as long as you have a balance of some sort and you're in the what I call the loam zone, then you can garden. So you can garden easily in a sandy loam, you can garden in a clay loam, you can garden in a silty loam, you can garden in one that's like perfectly balanced and is just like a straight up loam. It's like right in the center of that triangle. But I want to remind you that your texture is what the texture is. You don't try to change your texture. You can't. You would have to dig up all your soil and start all over again. The only way to change your texture is to build planters and fill it up with garden soil. So you can't really change your texture. It just doesn't work. The volumes are too huge, to dig out all your dirt and start over again. It's pretty crazy. So it is important to understand what your texture is, because overly sandy soil is tricky because it drains really fast and it doesn't hold on to nutrients. And clay soil can be hard because it usually gets kind of hard and compacted, and there's not a lot of air pockets in clay soil. But at the same time, clay soil has some positive benefits as well. Yeah, I can ask a quick one. Loam, the question is like, what is loam? And loam is a good balance of clay, sand, and silt-sized particles. Yeah, it's like 40% sandy particles, 40% silt particles, and like 20% clay particles is going to get you in a really good loam zone. If you have a little bit more clay, it's going to be a clay loam or something like that. So it's all about the size of the particles, as opposed to like an actual description of a thing. It's about the size of those mineral particles. As long as you got loam, you can garden. Straight clay, that's tough. Gardening on the sand, if you've ever tried to plant stuff on the beach, there's a few things that you can do, but you're not going to grow, really good tomato or anything. So that's your texture. So you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. That's the slogan for texture. That's what it is. You work with it. What you can do instead is you can work with your soil structure. This is the goal to the whole thing. And so you're promoting your soil food web by adding organic matter. And the one thing that's going to do is it's going to improve your soil structure. It's going to get to the point where you have this balanced soil where it's 45, 25, 25, 5. That's what you're shooting for. And so soil structure is one of the big pieces of creating good soil structure is to create aggregates in the soil. In other words, it's those mineral particles that get grouped into sort of like these aggregate balls. And so here are all the mineral particles in a dispersed state, and then humus comes into play. Humus, compost, organic matter, whatever it is, and it holds them together and forms it into like this chocolate chip, sort of meatball thing, right? And so the mineral particles are all held together by that. What happens is these become the new texture, so to say. And so that allows more air pockets. The concept is to think of like, if you took a jar and filled it with marbles, there'd be lots of air pockets in between all those balls, right? A whole like jar of balls. There's pockets between there because of the way that they sort of balance on one another. That's sort of what's happening when you create aggregates in your soil. So you're trying to promote a healthy, improved soil structure. That's what you're doing. And you're adding the humus, the organic matter, in order to make that happen. You're working within the soil, you're promoting that soil food web, and you're making it all happen that way. So aggregation is when they sort of, form those balls, and now you got these air pockets. So now you're opening up the soil. It's super important when it comes to clay soils because they can really stack up and get really compacted. But it also helps with sandy soils because the other thing that happens with those aggregates made out of the humus and the mineral particles, kind of hard to see that a little bit, is it helps your soil hold water. So there's something called field capacity. That's the amount of water that your soil can hold, okay? Every soil has a certain field capacity measurement. It's just the water holding ability of the soil. How good of a sponge is it? Is it a good sponge or is it a bad sponge? Because what happens is when it rains, the water passes through the ground. And so you're at something called the saturation point. This is during the rain event, or when your sprinkler is on, or when you're standing over the hose, or whatever the case might be. When you water the ground, and this is another important consideration, we won't get into it here, but when I talk about watering, we don't water plants, we water the garden, okay? You're watering the ground, you're not watering the plant. For the first couple of weeks, I water the plant to make sure it gets established. But after that, I'm watering the garden. So you're watering the ground. And so when water goes onto the ground, it fills all those pockets between those aggregates, right? All those air spaces, it gets fully filled with water on a real good rainy day. Gravity pulls it all down, okay? So that's what's happening. So on the rainy day, don't go out there. Don't do anything out there. That was actually my best excuse. I was a head gardener for 5 years, and that was when I took a day off. It's a rainy day, and one of the reasons is you don't want to go stomping around on your soil because you'll compact it, right? So that was what I always told my boss. It's like, oh, I don't want to wreck the soil, so I better just stay in here and drink coffee and read a book or something, and then they figure out something for me. You know, they need to do houseplants or something. But don't go out there and smush on it. So let it rain, let it finish. And what happens is gravity will pull a certain amount of it through. And it'll get down into the water table, into the groundwater, and then that's where it goes. The rest of it stays in the soil as the field capacity. That's the amount of water that your soil can hold on to. Now you want to have a high field capacity. Why? So you don't have to water so much. So the water doesn't run out before the next rain event. So you have, because this is the water that is held on to the soil, that's the water that your plants use for all of their metabolism. That's what they absorb. They don't absorb water from the air. They don't, like if you spritz your plants, and like your house plants, they like that. It feels good. It cools them off and things like that. But they don't use that water to metabolize. They don't use it for photosynthesis or for respiration or for any of that stuff. It's not part of their, it's not like flowing through the vascular system or anything. They get it all from the roots, right? They suck it up through the roots and then they release it through the pores of the leaves. And so if there's no water in that soil, they have no water to metabolize. And so then if they can't metabolize, they can't conduct photosynthesis, they can't make the sugars that they use to power all their growth. And then they kind of slow down. They tend to slow down, and then ultimately, if they get to the point where the soil is completely dry, it uses up all this water and it gets completely dry, that's when they wilt. That's called the wilting point. So it rains, the soil holds onto a X amount of water, whatever that number is. The plants use that water up. When it's all used up, there's no more water, and then they start to flop over and they start to wilt, right? So that was what happened with like the plant sale that one time, and the plants got there too soon and then they started wilting, right? They ran out of water. They didn't have any water to absorb to keep themselves going. So what you're doing as you're promoting that living soil and you're improving soil structure by adding, the one lesson of this whole thing is add organic matter to your soil. That's really all you got to do. And what I'm up here to do is to tell you why that all works. That's the whole thing. All my teaching, all my garden teaching is not just to give you the how-tos. Anybody can say the how-tos. I give you the why-dos. I want you to know why you're doing stuff, because if you understand why this stuff is important, why adding organic matter to the soil is important, then you'll probably do it, hopefully, after this, like if you're not doing it already. But you know what you're doing. You feel like you have a handle on what's happening in the garden. That's when gardening's fun. When you feel confident, when you're out there and you're like, I know what I'm doing. I can make this work. And so I always want you to understand why I'm telling you to do something. So what I'm telling you to do, the how-to is add organic matter to your soil. And we'll talk a little bit more in the details exactly how to do that. But I want you to understand why we do it, because then you can tell your friends, and you can tell everybody else, and you can have a soil building party, or you can do all that kind of stuff, right? So field capacity, you're adding that organic matter, it forms aggregates, which then are able to hold on to the more moisture. And so your field capacity goes up. So that means if it rains on Tuesday, and then it doesn't rain again until like next Saturday, the Saturday after that, you have enough water in your soil for the plants to do their thing. If you have too low of a field capacity, it could rain on Tuesday, but none of that rain gets held by the soil. It all just drains away. And by Wednesday afternoon, all your plants are wilting again. That's when you know you have a poor field capacity. So it makes it easier to grow plants. You don't have to water as much. They don't get stressed out. Plants get stressed out when they wilt. It's not good for a lot of them. Some of them, like one wilting, and that's the end of it. If you've ever grown like a stilby or something like that, wilts once and then it looks terrible until it grows back again. So that's your field capacity. It's how much water your soil can hold. And if you can get it measured, all this stuff can be determined through soil testing. So you can send this stuff to Cornell or SUNY, I think, that you can do a soil test, and you can find out what your soil texture is. You can find out the organic matter content of your soil. You can find out the field capacity of your soil. Another thing that the organic matter is going to do to help promote your soil, to make your garden grow better, is it's going to make your soil more fertile. That's the other big piece of the puzzle. So you're improving the structure of your soil, you're improving the water holding ability of the soil, a term called field capacity, and you're also improving the fertility of your soil. So compost is not fertilizer. That's the thing to remember. It's not fertilizer. Fertilizer is the actual nutrient ingredients. Compost is a fertility enhancer. That's what compost does. It enhances the fertility of your soil by helping your soil hold on to the nutrients better, just like they hold on to the water better. So what's going on in the soil, there's something called cation exchange. We don't have to get into the science of it, but if you may remember in chemistry class, like opposites attract and like charges repel, right? And the particles in the soil solution have a charge. The nutrients have positive charges, and the roots also have a positive, the roots have a negative charge. And so the other thing is the soil particles have a negative charge. And so the soil particles are negatively charged, so not all of them, but some of them. And so they can hold on to nutrients. They can hold on to the nutrients. They cling to them because they have opposite charges, because the nutrients are all positive, like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, all those nutrients, right? They have positive charges. Some of the soil particles have negative charges, and the root has a negative charge, and it brushes past the soil particle, and then they do a swap. The root will like give a hydrogen cation, a positive hydrogen, and it'll take some of the sulfur, and it'll absorb it into the plant, and it'll do its thing. It's something called cation exchange. So that's what's going on underground. All these nutrients are swapping from the soil, jumping from the soil and jumping onto the roots, okay? Now, there are certain soil particles that have that negative charge that will hold on to nutrients. One of them is clay. This is why clay is actually really fertile. If it wasn't so compacted and so difficult because of its compaction, it would be a great soil to grow stuff in. That's why they could do all that cotton like down in the southeast, because it's a heavy clay soil, but it's super fertile. It holds on to nutrients really well. There's one other particle in a soil that holds on to nutrients, and what might it be? It's the humus, it's the compost, it's the organic matter. That is also negatively charged, and so it holds on to nutrients. That's why compost is a fertility enhancer. It's not a food, though as it breaks down, it tends to release some nutrients, but it's holding on, it's helping those aggregates hold on to the nutrients. So just like the water, if you have a soil that isn't fertile, it's because they don't hold on to the nutrients. So you can throw as much fertilizer on that as you want. Hopefully it's organic fertilizer. Stay away from the synthetics. The synthetics are killing your soil food web. No Miracle Grow on the garden. No granular 10-10-10 and all that other stuff. That's a no-no. And I know because I did it that way when I first started gardening and I didn't know any better. And now I know better. So you just use organic fertilizers, all those Espoma things and stuff like that. You can use all those. And that just adds to the soil food web and it promotes it that way. And so even if you have a low clay content and a low organic matter content, like a sandy soil, those nutrients just wash right out. They just disappear. So you can feed and feed and feed and feed, and that doesn't hold on to anything. So you don't want to add clay. For some obvious reasons. You don't want to compact your soil by adding clay. Plus, remember I said don't change your texture. You really can't change your texture, but you can add organic matter to your soil by top dressing with compost or humus or whatever the case might be. And so and what it does is it slowly works its way into the ground. So it's called top dressing. Like every spring in your garden beds, if you're building your soil food web, it's not really that effective to just sort of do it all at once and put like a foot of compost on top of it. It's slow. So you do like an inch at a time. Every spring, put like an inch and a half of compost on your garden beds, and you don't have to turn it in, right? So if these are existing beds, you don't have to turn it in. You can just put it on the beds and the plants will grow through it, and the humus will just melt into the soil and it'll continue to improve it. If, however, it's a brand new garden bed, or it's a bed that if you have the gumption to dig them all out and set them aside, you can go in there and you can actually turn it in a little bit if you want to. So for brand new beds, I will turn in some compost into the soil. But for existing beds, just top dress it. Just spread an inch down on the ground. Spring's a great time to do that. Then if you need to mulch, you can put some mulch on top of that. You can put it right on top of the mulch if you want to. It's going to work its way into the soil. We have a question in the back. We'll answer it. Yeah, so the question is, do you do the same thing in your vegetable bed? Yes, and actually you kind of have to do it in the vegetable bed because you're using up a lot of the fertility in that bed every time you harvest a crop. So it's the kind of thing that, like in my vegetable bed, I would have done it in the fall, so it's good to go, and then I usually cover it with straw or something like that to keep it safe through the winter. Otherwise, but if you haven't done it, you can do it like right now, like this before you start planting, and it'll be perfect. But then every time you harvest, you want to do it again. You want to put some more down and do it again. Yeah. So that's what's going on with, we'll do one more question. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The question was, I have clay soil, how much peat moss is appropriate? None, zero. That's like old school, not the right way to do it. There are soil conditioners if you have a clay soil. That you can purchase, but the peat moss is not a good thing to do. It goofs up the pH and the acidity, and if you don't, and it can repel water. Actually, that's the problem with peat moss. Unless it's wet, it repels water. So don't do that. Because I worked for years. I worked for a nursery in Westchester County, and the crews had been trained to add peat moss to the planting hole. The idea being it holds moisture, it's going to help things out. But actually, if you just have a good, healthy soil, it's going to work way better than using it in the peat moss. So just you don't need it. Peat moss is for potting mixes. That's all I use it for. That's what I use it for. Yeah. So if you have extra, you can share with your friends that do a bunch of potting mixes and stuff like that. All right, so organic matter is doing all this good stuff, and the organic matter is promoting your soil food web. The more active your soil food web is, the more organic matter you can get into the soil, because those guys are going to break it down. The fungi are going to break it down, the microorganisms and the bacteria and all that other good stuff. We'll keep rolling here. I don't want to keep you guys too long. Promoting a living soil helps balance soil pH. So I just mentioned adding peat moss is going to make it really acidic. If you want to end up with everything about gardening and the environment that you garden in is about not living in extremes. You want to avoid extremes. So you want to avoid a really extreme clay soil. You want to avoid a really dry soil. You also want to avoid an extreme pH or measure of alkalinity or acidity in your soil. And what this chart shows is the way that nutrients will make that jump. Like I was talking about how they flip, they'll jump from the soil particle onto the root. At certain pHs, and this is a pH of 4, nothing will jump. So if you have a really acidic soil, the lower the pH number, the more acidic your soil is, then none of those nutrients will jump. They just won't make that jump onto the root. And so that's why that can be a problematic soil. What you're hoping for is to be living like right around the 5.5 to 6.5. That's your sweet spot for your pH. Most times when you do a soil test, it comes back. It's usually not down in the 4s. That's pretty rare. It's also usually not like up around 7. That's a very alkaline soil, even though technically it's kind of neutral. You usually end up at like between 5.5 and 6.5, and then you can kind of grow anything because now everything can start jumping. The nitrogen can jump, the phosphorus doesn't really start jumping until 6. Potassium can jump, sulfur, all the good nutrients that you have will start to jump. So this is why pH is important, though it's not super duper important. It doesn't if you're having trouble with a plant, it's usually not because of the pH. Let me just say it that way. A lot of people the plant dies and they're like, it must be the pH, it must be goofed up because somebody sort of overhyped pH in the past. It's usually not really the problem. But what happens is that organic matter is going to help balance your pH. It's going to create this nice soil solution with a balanced pH, so it's not going to go crazy one direction or the other. It's all about why we want to add organic matter to the soil. So humus happens, compost is created. That's a little slogan here. So if we need this stuff, where do we get this stuff? You can buy, humus is the kind of thing that it develops when you leave stuff on the ground. like the leaves that just stay on the ground. That becomes like a leaf mold, and that develops the humus. There's always a humus, like walk in the woods somewhere, there's a humus layer on the top of this actual topsoil. That's the organic matter content that's developing and breaking down naturally year after year. This basically just happens. It's something that just happens. Ultimately, in your ornamental beds, because now we talk about sustainable gardening, right? We don't talk about traditional or traditional, that we talk a little bit less about traditional and ornamental gardening, in that we'd like to find ways to have fewer inputs into our garden and have it become more of like a balanced ecology, right? That's what we're going for these days. When I would give this, if I was going to give this talk 20 years ago, that wouldn't even be a topic. When I started gardening professionally in the year 2000, it was not about sustainable gardening techniques. It was about, copying the castles in England. That was what we were trying to do, right? Now we try to grow meadows, and we try to have pollinator gardens, and we try to promote the bugs and the birds and the bees and all that other stuff. And you can only do that by having what we would call a sustainable garden. And you can get that sustainable garden by allowing your detritus to break down. But sometimes if you've been doing it kind of wrong for a long time, you don't have that soil food web. It's not there. And so you can't just let everything sit there on the ground, because it's just going to sit there and it's not going to break down. Nothing's going to break it down because you don't have a soil food web. So you have to initiate the soil food web, and you do that by top dressing with the compost. So you have to get going with something. So you can buy bags of humus. Humus happens, but you can also buy it. It's not cheap, but you can make compost. And remember, humus, compost, organic matter, it's all the same stuff. It's all the same thing. So you can make your own compost. So are people here composting, right? Yes, yes, okay. If you're not, you should start. When I used to give gardening talks, once again, 20 years ago, I probably would have got like 3 or 4 hands to be raised. So people understand the importance of composting now. And it was usually somebody who had like gardened in the 40s and 50s, because that's when all gardening was organic until the 1940s and 50s, when they developed those synthetic fertilizers. Everybody was an organic gardener, okay? So you make the compost yourself. How do you make it? You add that detritus. And there's 2 kinds of detritus. There's browns and there's greens. So there's carbon rich and there's nitrogen rich. Those are you that are composting. So a lot of the stuff that comes out of the kitchen, that's your nitrogen rich stuff. That's your lettuce scraps and your vegetable scraps and things like that. And you have to add it to it with an equal measure of browns. And then together they will break down in the presence of water and air and all those good critters, and they will break down into compost. It's basically what you're doing. Let me just get a drink here. So compost is humus that you create, and there's a lot of different ways of doing it. This is kind of the basic setup. I usually start 50-50. If it gets smelly, I add more browns. If it doesn't work fast enough, I add more greens, and then I can kind of get to a balance. It takes a while to get a compost system effectively running in balance. It just takes a little time for it to happen. But once you got it, you got it. There's different techniques of doing it. I have a lot of lazy gardener type techniques. So the heap is the lazy gardener way, the lazy gardener guy. You just throw it out in the pile and wait. It takes time. You don't have to turn it. You don't have to do anything. I often have several composting techniques per garden. This is the best one for like the leaves and the branches and the big stuff. And if you have a corner somewhere in the property, you can just throw it back there. But you could even throw back your kitchen scraps and things like that if you wanted to. Best if it's out of the way. And it's going to take about a year or so, and the stuff is always on the bottom. So if you've been doing this, if somebody's been dumping lawn clippings and autumn leaves, those are both browns and greens, twigs and prunings, maybe you have a hedge that you prune, whatever the case might be. If they've just been dumping it in the same spot for multiple years, underneath that pile, there's a whole bunch of really good stuff. So you can dig under there, you got to go to the bottom of the pile, and there's all your compost. And now you can go and you can, tomorrow or over the weekend, you can go and you can top dress all your beds. So you can do everything that I've been talking about here. So if that's been going on, you got it already. So go find it. There's also the bin system. This is typically like if you got a decent sized veggie garden and you're going to have a lot of stuff coming out of there, like when you harvest and things like that, you can do it in bins. So you can, sometimes people make them out of pallets. I see them made out of wire and poles and things like that. And you just throw it in the bin. It's going to take a little time, but you can kind of stash it away in a good part of the garden. And you're going to have to turn it every once in a while. Now, one way that people make mistakes in their composting, and I just want to touch on this quickly, is they turn their bins too much. Like they go out there every day, I turn it, right? I'm doing a good thing. No, you have to get it to heat up. It has to heat up. It has to get to a certain temperature, at least 185 degrees for that stuff to start to break down. And the bin is already so small that it's really hard for it to get to that heat. They get to those high heats in like industrial composting. That's when they can get up into the 200s and they can really break everything down. And you can compost bones and all sorts of stuff. You can't really do that in your home garden. I wouldn't compost, we don't put in dairy or any oils or any meats and things like that. We want to keep it out of our home composting system because we just don't have the mass to get to the temperatures that we need to break that stuff down, even though it is biodegradable. But if you turn it every 2 weeks or so, and every time you turn it, compost is going to sift down to the bottom. And then you add some more, you add more ingredients, and then you turn it every couple of weeks. And the stuff will start to develop, and sooner or later, you're going to have some compost underneath. What I talk about, I do, lots of times people do what's called a 3-bin system, where they'll have 3 bins in a row. And while they're filling one, they get one full, and then they can kind of just turn it and fill the second one. And then by the time the third one's full, the first one is ready to harvest. You can take it all out of there, and then you can start filling that one. You get in like this cycle. And so in the past, what I've done a 3-bin system, but I did it in the form of pits. So I read about it in my book, and it seemed to kind of strike a chord. There's the garden columnist Margaret Roach. She writes for the Times. So she interviewed me when my book came out. I did her podcast, and she was like amazed about the pit method. It's basically a 3-bin method, but I dig a hole in the ground, and then you don't have to turn it. You just bury it. You're burying your garbage, which I guess the farmers used to do right back in the day. And it happens a lot quicker because it's underground. You bury anything biodegradable and it ain't gonna last long once it's buried. And so I would add browns and greens and then browns and then dirt and then greens and then browns and then dirt. And I'd fill my first hole, dig a second hole, fill that one. And by the time the third hole was getting full, I can harvest my second hole or my first hole. And the beauty of the pit method is that you can expand it or you can shrink it. So once you build a bin, you're kind of stuck with the size of the bin. With the pits, it's like, we'll start with 4x4 and go down a foot and see how that works. It's like, that's too big, I can shrink it, or that's too small, I can make it bigger. And it's also easy to hide. The reason I did the pit method in the first place is I was renting a house, and the landlord was like, you can't have compost. You're like throwing your garbage in the backyard, it's not allowed. And I was like, yeah, okay, I get it. And so I dug pits. And so I hid him behind the deck. And he's like, what's this pile of dirt here? I was like, I was digging, planting some stuff or something in there. And they didn't even know I was composting. So it was like a secret way to compost if you are renting. Okay. I once lived in a garden where we could actually throw our kitchen scraps into the backyard and they would just melt because the soil food web was so good. And they would just all melt in there, and there were like hostas and ferns and all sorts of stuff growing out. And we would just like cut up our salad and then throw it out there. No dressing though, no dressing. Other bin options that are fun. This is the 3-bin system right here where there's 3 of them. But a fun way to do it is to use straw bales because those pallets are going to rot. The wood's going to rot after about 5-6 years, and you'll have to start over again. People will use straw bales, and they will rot too, but it becomes part of the compost. And then when they totally fall apart, you just buy some more bales and do it over again. And it actually looks kind of nice. It has kind of like a cool look. So you can do the straw bale technique. Couple more things. We'll let you guys get out of here. The composters, this is good for like kitchen scraps. It's kind of like a big barrel. It's about 4 feet tall. I'm not a big fan of them. It's good for small gardens, kitchen scraps. You can kind of stash it in a spot out of the way. You don't really have to turn it in there. What happens is the compost collects in the bottom and you can open the door and get it out. It takes a couple of months. Typically, these, you have to be careful how many greens you put in. That's the trick. It gets a little too like stinky, slimy. So it's always about kind of balancing it with enough browns. So shredded newspaper or cardboard or something else like that. And go easy on the eggshells. Eggshells can go in compost, but they don't break down. And so then you got all these eggshells that you're like throwing all over the garden. So it's good. It's calcium, which your plants use to make cell walls, right? So it's not bad, but they don't break down. So if you're like having a 6-egg omelet every day, that's going to be way too many eggs. Or if it was like just Easter, right? So these composters are pretty fun. There's some better ones that are kind of work a little bit better, the stacked tray varieties. And they can look pretty nice too. You know, it's a nice wood. It's got the mesh. It's going to rot. That's why a lot of them are plastic. The wooden ones aren't going to last forever. They really aren't. And it's just a sequence of trays. And as the compost breaks down, it slowly sifts down to the bottom. That's how the tray ones work. It's small. It's not going to like do a whole vegetable garden supply of stuff. It's going to work for your kitchen scraps and things like that. There's some cool ones. One more. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, so the question is sort of like, what do you do when it ain't working, or if there's like disease problems and things like that? You could. If there's a rodent issue, and a rodent could be a squirrel or it could be a rat. When I talk to gardeners up in the Adirondacks, it's bears is what they're worried about. The pit method works great because you're burying the stuff. They're interested in the greens. They want the green scrap. They want to eat that apple core. They want to eat that. They don't care about your browns or anything. So the pit method works because I bury it. These can work if they're not, but they might get a little adventurous and chew their way in there and try to get in there. There's another method called a tumbler that works really well that I'll show you in just a second. So you could do it that way. Yeah?
When you say you bury it for the pit method, how much soil is on top for the lid, so to speak?
Right. So when I'm doing the pit method, I always start with greens. That's like my first. And then I put browns on top of it. So a little shredded paper or whatever the case might be. And I cover it with enough soil so I can't see the browns. And yeah, it doesn't have, it's not like fully buried. So it could be just a small little spot in this 4x4 pit. And I just keep stacking it up there. So it's always browns, greens, dirt, browns, greens, dirt. In these kinds of composters, you can throw a little dirt in there every once in a while, or a little compost in there every once in a while. It's like priming the pump, kind of getting things in there. A lot of people in these systems, they're just doing greens and browns, and it doesn't really get cooking because they don't have the microorganisms in there. Now, don't buy compost starter in a bottle or something. You don't have to. Just dig some dirt out of your garden. There should be those ingredients in there, or take some of the compost from the bag that you bought and throw it in there and just get it going. Once you got it going, it'll be fine. Yeah. The question is, should we buy worms? I don't bother buying worms. You can vermicompost. Have you heard of that? Where you can only compost with worms. People do in the city in their apartment. You have like a bin with worms in it, but it has to be a special worm. It's this red worm, a special worm, not an earthworm. Yeah. But the worms will find their way in there. I don't add them to it. I don't worry about them. Okay, another question. We'll do it. Snakes. Yeah. Snakes are people too, right? Or no. Right? I mean, this is part, and actually this is a really interesting point. And I have to say, like, having been a professional gardener, I was always like fighting the critters. It was always like me against the critters. Rabbits and groundhogs and snakes and this and that and the other thing. And in recent years, I've started to think about my garden more as an ecology and as a habitat. And so, I mean, Carrie, my wife, would freak out if she saw a snake, but we do have snakes in our backyard. So it might not be, you don't want to promote the snakes necessarily, but actually having a snake, any amphibian in your garden is a really good sign that it's a healthy garden, because they absorb all the toxins like immediately through their skin. Like frogs are the best indication of a healthy garden. And so that just means your compost pile is good. It's like doing good. So just like, run away from them if you see them. Yeah. Let's just get a couple more through here. Yeah, they are. They're more scared of you. These are really cool. Your composting system can actually be pretty interesting and nice looking. These are these beehive composters that are, I saw them first in the UK. And it's the same tray stack thing, but they're cool looking. That's really the trick. It's like a neat sculpture, right? And it's the same thing. They will sort of rot after a while. You tend to use cedar or some sort of durable wood. Don't use pine. It'll rot really quick. So, and then they paint them up and they look like these neat little houses in the garden. So there are fun ways of doing it. There's also, this is a technique out of India. I don't know if I have a picture of it here, but they use jars. And so like we have this little, it's like stacks of jars, these terracotta jars, and then there's one lid on the top, and you start filling one jar, and then once it's full, you go to the second jar. It's just like the bin sequence, but it's in these small little jars. And there's holes in them, so then it breathes and stuff like that. I like the beehive composters. This is the tumbler that I was talking about. So if people are like in the city or on a terrace, they don't have any ground that they can work with, you can buy tumblers. This is a really big one. You can buy much smaller ones, and they're sealed in, so the rat or whatever isn't going to get in there. That's the beauty of the tumblers. It happens really fast too. It's quicker than the other techniques. And so you put some stuff in and you give give it a spin. And then every time you put something in, you just give it a spin. It all starts to, gather up in the bottom there. The trick to the tumblers is you either need 2 tumblers or you need a dual tumbler. Because once you fill it, you have to spin it for a couple of weeks until it's ready. And so you can't keep adding more stuff in it. You have to stop at some point. And so that's why a lot of them have 2 doors. So you're filling one chamber. Once it's full, you start filling the other chamber. You keep spinning it for a couple of weeks, and then you can finally harvest the first chamber and then go from there. So if you do get a tumbler, make sure it's a double tumbler. That's the trick. But you can have good compost within 2 to 4 weeks. So it happens fast. So I've done it, like I've had clients, they're gardening on the 30th floor in the city, on some, patio or terrace or something like that, and they can't really compost. Actually, I got there and they were composting on a tarp. Like they were doing a heap on a tarp. And I was like, maybe not. Maybe we shouldn't do it. Like, let's get a cool tumbler and we kind of get you going that way. So, but they wanted to do it, which is great. This is hard to read, but I think when you see if you watch the video, you'll be able to see this a little bit better. I got this from homecompostingmadeeasy.com. How do you site your composting, right? So we talked about the importance of the living soil. How do you get a living soil? You need compost or humus or organic matter. So if you're going to be composting, you have to put it in the right spot. You have to have good air circulation for your composting system. So not like stuck in some hole somewhere. It's just not going to happen the same way. You'll get fungal problems. And actually circling back about the diseased things, if you have a plant that has a disease, don't put it in your composting. So if it has a fungus or a powdery mildew or like a tomato blight, heaven forbid, you have to just bag it up in the garbage and it goes to the landfill, hopefully. It's one of the reasons why I tend to not use like the town compost. Yeah, because you don't know what went in there. So maybe you could use it in some faraway bed on the corner of the property, but I would never put it in my vegetable garden. And I know people that have had trouble with that. Like they did it, they didn't have enough, they didn't want to buy it, and they used it, and they had some trouble in the garden that year. So be careful. Adequate air circulation, not in the full sun. It needs some sun, like some good morning sun or something like that would be nice, but not all day sun. That cooks it too much. It's too hot. I tend to put these things on the bare ground. I put it like right on the ground. That's why, you know, the closer to the soil, the more active the composting is going to be. So if you make a bin, you don't have a floor on it. You want to avoid that. Away from large trees and vines, they're going to grow their roots into your composting. So not like at the base of the maple tree, right? Because it's going to shoot its roots into it. And it's actually going to steal some of the nutrients and all sorts of stuff. And then don't put it like up against the garage, because it's going to rot your wooden structure. So you got to be careful about that. So good air, not full sun, but some sun, not like dark shade, not under the hemlock tree, right? On the bare ground, away from large trees, so the roots don't go in there, and then away from wooden structures. And then you can be making this stuff yourself. One more, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I happen to have a shady spot on the side.
Right.
Is it okay in more or less maybe an hour of sun once the trees leave out?
That's a little low. Like it's usually like a part sun. So full sun is 6 hours or more. Part sun is 3 to 6 hours. That would be best. Shade is considered anything less than 3 hours. So it's what it means is it's going to be harder for it to heat up, and it's not going to break down as fast. And so you might run into, what I'd end up doing is balancing and using more browns and less greens, because the greens are just gonna like stay slimy and gross. Yeah. So 3 to 6 hours of sun. All right. So hopefully, here's my happy gardening sign. Hopefully this was the early part of the program helped you understand the importance of the living soil food web. That's really the goal of what we're talking about here. And so if I'm going to tell you to promote your living soil food web, so you have what? Better soil structure, better field capacity. You don't have to water as much anymore. Doesn't that sound great? Better fertility. You don't have to feed all the time, or things will grow better because you have better fertility. So you get that by promoting that soil food web, by adding organic matter to it. You have to slowly get organic matter back into your soil. And sooner or later, like 7 years, if you're starting from scratch today, 5, 6 years from now, your soil will be just chugging along. Your soil food web will be rocking. You'll be able to throw all your clippings just right at the base of those plants, let them just rot right back into the soil. You won't rake as much. You won't have to do all that work, but you do have to get started with it. And you get started with it by composting and then top dressing every season with at least an inch. Every time you have more compost, just put it out there right away. Don't save it for next spring. Just put it back, put it anywhere in the garden where you think you need it. And then you too can be promoting a living soil in your own garden. That's what we're doing here. Thank you very much, everybody.